address that when we're impatient and the other group doesn't want to move forward? How do we, and kind of how you and I would identify this willful ignorance, how do we move the needle forward and helping them understand and see the perspective in a way? Like, how could we have better addressed how to put forth our idea?
Yeah. So I think it has to be done one-on-one. I never find it fruitful to address someone else's blind spots publicly or in front of others. So I like to pull a person aside one-on-one. I like to ask them if they're open to some perspective. So
I always like that question.
Are you open to some perspective?
And you have dropped that on me so many times. Are you open to some perspective?
Yes.
Yes.
And then, yes. And then I like to remind people that we as leaders are not judged by our intentions. We're judged by our impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so sometimes I think it's helpful to say, I wonder if you might consider that when you said this, here's how it landed on me. Here's the impact. I find people more receptive to that, generally, to say, okay, it landed when you said this, when you stated this, here's how it landed on me, here's the impact.
And you say that with such grace and kindness. It's not, and I remember, Brene Brown, I'll bring it up, I don't know if I can or not on a podcast, but she had talked about in one of her little videos I saw, and it said, I'm not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm a hell of a lot kinder.
Yeah.
Is because you're not playing nice, you're actually genuinely providing some kindness here to say, like, hey, I'm a safe space if you're open to receiving a perspective here. Yeah. And you say it with such kindness. And I think that's a tone we often don't take in community, corporate, social, is how to react with it or present it in kindness. We're
triggered, right? So we have triggers. So I'll give an example. I was brought into an organization to work with their leadership team, most of whom were male. And while the CEO was introducing me, he talked about all my credentials, which was great. And then he ended by saying, and let's face it, she's a hell of a lot better looking to look at than me for the next few hours. I was triggered because my whole life, being a female, usually the only female.
Can we take a moment of pause? What did he say again?
He said that. And he meant it as a compliment, which
sure.
At my age,
I'm sure.
Fine.
Okay. I want to pause this moment right here because I have something I want to say about it, but let's continue. Okay. So he says that.
He said it. And so as a female who has always felt like I've had to overcome that, I was triggered and I was seeing red, I call it. And I probably was red, from anger. But I just moved on. But afterwards, I pulled him aside and said, do you have a minute for some perspective? And he said, yes. And I said, I understand that you were just kind of talking. And I said, but I need you to understand that all of the credentials that you had listed as to why I was here were thrown out the minute you talked about the way I looked. And that was the impact it had on me. And he was mortified.
Wow.
He said, oh, I'm so sorry. I hadn't thought of that. I said, because I don't know that you would have introduced a male leader coming in by talking about the way he looked versus all the things he had accomplished. And so for me, that was a little bit triggering, and it was a bit, it kind of took my credentials down a notch because that made me feel like, well, is that why I'm here? Or am I here because of all those things I accomplished? Yeah. And so he was open to it and apologized, which I was looking more just to give him perspective, but
right.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's definitely a kind approach to take to it, because the trigger is what did you do in that trigger point? Like, what was your mindfulness conscious, like,
You breathe.
Amy, don't blow up,
You
because I
breathe.
want to scissor kick him. Like, like, how do you refrain? What do you say to yourself? Because I
these
typically
people are
wanna
paying
scissor
you.
kick.
You think I mean,
Oh, these people are paying you. That's my mantra.
breathe? Like, I don't, I mean, but at the same, it is hard. It's
Well,
hard.
yeah.
And in my younger days, I wouldn't have probably been so kind.
Yeah.
In my 20s, I wouldn't have been as
Holy
kind.
shit.
And it happened way more frequently then.
Yeah.
But I learned that didn't get me anywhere.
Right.
What got me somewhere was to say, because I have to believe, and I have come to understand that 99 probably percent of the time, there's no negative intent there.
Right.
It's their own automatic thoughts and trigger. It's their own perspectives.
Right.
And that come out in blind spots.
It's not done intentionally.
No, not
And
most
so-
of the time. Not
Right. And so when I said that moment of pause is going back to that point there in the scenario,
right.
where it would say, well, there's a perspective of, let's say, that the cisgender white male, whoever one deems, the privileged one in power and leadership. That's not going to be this show at this point right now. We can talk all day long about that one. But there's that perspective where he is saying, that is not what I meant.
Right.
And so there's also, on the diversity spectrum of inclusion, wherever we want to be with this, how we measure it, is it's also that individual's perspective. Because
right.
we can't make them feel like a piece of shit if we're wanting to help them improve how they may come across and how
Right.
their actions may be perceived. Because it is definitely a thing. Because, you would hear, like, oh, you look good today, or she's a hell of a lot better looking. These things, they're never done. You know who those individuals are. It's never done with this intent to criticize you. It's a form of flattery to them, but it is.
Yes.
Then, like you said, it was like, but it knocked my credentials out of the way, because women, it's had to take this for us to get here.
Correct.
Yeah.
I can't just walk. What many people don't understand as a consultant is that I can't just walk into a room and have anyone assume that I know what I'm talking about, that I ran business units, that I had P&Ls larger than some of the companies I consult with. No one will assume that. In fact, I get assumed I was an HR professional because I'm a female.
Yeah, you get that assumed a lot.
And I never was in HR, which I'm not, there's nothing insulting about being an HR professional, but that's not my background. It's just not my background. So, I ran business units.
We love
I
HR
ran,
people. We do.
Yeah, I ran, P&Ls for a Fortune 500 company, but I don't get the assumption that I was at that level of leadership, because quite frankly, there aren't very many females who in corporate America are at that level of leadership. So it's really hard and triggering when someone makes an assumption that I wasn't there, or that I didn't have that responsibility, or they're surprised by it. Somebody looked at my LinkedIn recently, and he's one of my clients, and said, I didn't realize that, that you were at this company and did that. That's impressive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was like he was surprised by it. That's a blind spot. And I mean, I appreciate it, but at the same time, it felt a little like, well, why didn't you assume that? Or why is that so impressive? There are other people that have been in those positions, but it's because I think there's that blind spot of oh, you're a female, or oh, you're this
or that.